Your ancestors ate the manna in the desert, but they died. This is the bread that comes down from heaven so that one may eat it and not die. I am the living bread that came down from heaven. Whoever eats this bread will live forever, and the bread that I will give is my flesh for the life of the world. The Gospel of the Lord. Afternoon. So we're still in ordinary time, but there's a shift this year. We go from Mark, and then we shift to John the last couple weeks. And preachers long for Mark because Mark is pretty simple. John has these complicated concepts, and we see one of them the last few weeks, the bread of life. Sometimes it's difficult to really understand who a person is, who they are at their center. That's the challenge of today's gospel. Who is Jesus? And what does he mean by this talk of the bread of life? I got some perspective on this as part of a recent experience I had. Just last Saturday, I and 11 others returned from a week-long mission trip to the mustard seed community in Jamaica. And while there, we had the opportunity to minister to men and women with severe mental and physical disabilities. It was a humbling experience, and after interacting with all the residents, I was often left wondering who was doing the ministering and who was being ministered to. I want to share an experience with one particular resident because I think it ties in well with the readings today, especially the gospel reading. One morning in Jamaica, as I wandered down the hill that led to the area where the residents gathered for devotions and morning prayer, I was struck by the scene of it all. It's a chaotic place. Dozens of people packed in a small area. There's always a dull roar of voices. And there are people all over the place wandering. Some of the residents seemed to be trapped in their own world. Others, though, were excited to talk with their friends and with the missionaries. I was doing my typical thing, wandering around the room. To use that cocktail party phrase, I was working the room. Not staying with anyone too long, but rather moving around the room and trying to meet some of the residents that I had actually met before and getting to know some of those who I hadn't. Eventually, I don't know how, but eventually I found myself in a corner of the room where there were several wheelchairs lined up. Well, in Jamaica, lined up is a matter of perspective. Let's just say there were a bunch of wheelchairs around. They're a little bit more liberal. Anyway, among these wheelchairs, I noticed that one of the aides was busily feeding two of the residents. It was obvious, even from a distance, that both were severely disabled. The aide was feeding the woman on the left and at the same time holding a bowl steady for the woman on the right. Her name, I found out, was Laura. And I began to hold her bowl so that the aide could focus on the other woman. Once I sat down, Laura's situation became more obvious to me. She was confined to a wheelchair and from what I could see was really uncommunicative. Every so often she would make noises, but it was nothing that made any sense to me. Her hands were curled up, more like claws than hands, but she was able to hold a spoon. And with me holding the bowl steady, she was able, with great difficulty, to dip the spoon into the oatmeal and bring it to her mouth. It probably took her about 30 minutes to eat that small bowl of oatmeal, with me holding that bowl all the time. There were no words that we exchanged, just the halting movement of her hands. And while I enjoyed our time together, I do remember being frustrated because as I looked into Laura's eyes, I felt that I was just seeing a shell. It was like there was this invisible barrier that I couldn't get through. Her true self remained hidden to me. So I'm going to break from the story for a second and go back to the gospel, because this is where it ties in. As I mentioned, today's gospel is actually a continuation story. So for those who were here last week, this is the finale of the gospel story. The gospel there ended with Jesus saying the words, "I am the bread of life. Anyone who comes to me shall not hunger, and anyone who believes in me shall not thirst." Today's gospel picks up the next line in that story. And after hearing Jesus speak those words, which we all know from hearing them so often, the people responded by saying, and I'll paraphrase, they said, "What are you talking about? What is this bread of life?" They aren't able to see beneath the surface. Jesus' divinity is still hidden to them. They just see Joe and Mary's little boy. They see the young man who grew up in their village, but they're unable to get past that. Even as Jesus reveals himself to them, his divine nature, they just can't put the pieces together and see what's beyond, what still remains hidden. It's very similar to my first meeting with Laura. I was stuck looking at that outside lair and couldn't see what was inside. The problem wasn't her, it was me. I saw in front of me a woman who needed to be fed rather than a woman who needed to be loved. During the week, the story of Laura and I continued. I discovered that she liked it when people talked to her. And while she couldn't respond, I could see the spark in her eye. There was something there. She had several friends in the community, and she smiled. She smiled a lot when she was with her friends. And towards the end of the week, when I walked by, she would reach her hand out and grab my hand to hold it. And she absolutely surprised the heck out of me when we said our goodbyes, and this woman in the wheelchair reached out for a hug. It was then that I felt that I finally saw the real Laura, and she was a beautiful woman. I am the bread of life. Jesus really didn't expect the people to understand instantly what he was talking about there. But it was an invitation to discover more, much like the invitation that started with a bowl of oatmeal. It was an invitation to understand Jesus, the Son of God, not just Joe and Mary's boy. It was an invitation into a deeper relationship with God. That same invitation is offered to us today as we celebrate the Eucharist together, the sacrament of the bread of life. During the celebration today and the upcoming week, I invite each of you to think about the meaning of Jesus as the bread of life in your own lives. It means something very different for each of us. Accept that invitation to get to know him better. Just like I discovered more about Laura by spending time with her, spend time with God in prayer this week. Open yourselves to being loved by him. I think you'll be amazed at what you discover behind that outside lair. And maybe you'll see a side of God that you've never seen before.